Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast, and my guest today is author Serena Choo. Serena, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Yeah, so like I was saying, before the show, I read one of your books. I haven't read your first book yet, Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome, but your work is really, really interesting. And, honestly, the reason why I selected your second book to read was just because I just wanted to read something that was going to let my mind kind of go a little bit. I didn't want to read like a how-to book. I was just going on a vacation where I just wanted to read something where, I was just going to basically enjoy it. And I wasn't going to be trying to figure out like, oh, I better underline this part and I better start doing this tomorrow. And, what's the best technique? I just want to kind of, unwind. And I got to say, like, it was the perfect way to, unwind and to have that kind of, vacation book, I guess, that I was looking for. And so the name of that book is The Monkey and the Zen and the Way of Zen, a transformational journey in 28 short stories. So they're basically a simple short stories in a book that, again, are really easy to read. I think it's like a vacation read for me, but obviously you could read it anytime. Like I could easily see someone, just sort of like waking up in the morning, reading one, or you could take like an afternoon or a couple days and read the whole thing, but just sort of like a Zen way of reading. And so was that the reason why you wanted to write that book? You just wanted to write something sort of like practical and like easy to read instead of something that say like, really like difficult and kind of difficult to get into? Or what was the reasoning for writing that?
Pretty much, although I have to say it didn't come from that place initially. So I'm really, really, really happy to hear you say that it was something that you were looking for, where you weren't actually looking for, the 10 steps and the how-to and all the things. Because after I wrote the Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome book, and how that came about was something quite unique again, but we can go into that later if we want to. But after I wrote Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome, I thought, okay, what now? And I really had no plans. But what I had been doing was I had been collating what I had called to myself consciousness notes. They were essentially insights that I'd had along the way. And a lot of it was, I'd shared a lot of it in Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome, but Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome is what I would call a more corporate type based book, a little bit more self-help maybe. And I wrote the skeleton of all these consciousness notes, and I thought, okay, it'd be nice if I do a kind of a reflection book, something with a prompt at the end and people can do their journaling. And I thought, but that really feels like hard work. And I read through some of what I had written, and it's almost like I didn't have energy for it. It felt like, I could get this out. And my head was going, yes, do it, do it, do it. And I thought, no, but it just feels, it felt like I was doing it because I could rather than because it was something that really had a life of its own almost. And then so I put it aside and I pulled them out one day and I was looking at it, and suddenly I came up with this idea that maybe I could, instead of doing something like, I don't know, a thing, 52 consciousness notes and 52 reflections, I thought maybe I could just pull out a certain number of them that might turn into stories. And so that's how the idea was initially born. I would just write stories. And I thought, maybe there could be Zen-inspired stories in the sense of not so much teaching Zen, but more around that they were, peaceful, that they were short, that they had a lesson within them, but not necessarily teaching anybody anything, and that they could meet people where they are. Because one of the things, and I remember this was many years ago. I don't know if you remember that film, Finding Nemo.
Okay. I just don't watch very many movies, so it's really odd that I haven't seen that movie, but I do know about it just because it's been talked about so much. So, yes. And I'm sure most people listening to this have heard it. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there was this scene in Finding Nemo, and it was unusual for me to actually go and watch that movie as well, because I don't have kids. And so anyway, I decided to go and watch this movie. And through the movie, I suddenly realized that, yes, this was a kid's movie, but there were so many layers to it. And it really, wherever your awareness was, wherever your consciousness was was where you took the messages from, or where you took the messages out of this movie. And so when I came upon this idea of writing the stories, I thought, well, if I can just convey the meaning of what I wanted to get across in terms of the insights that I'd had through story and simple stories, which were really short that people could read that didn't feel like work. The hope was that people would just take away what was helpful for them without it feeling like, oh, I have to work on myself. I have to fix myself. There's something wrong with me. It was really just something that could be entertaining, but could also be meaningful for the person who read it.
Yeah. And, that's exactly what I experienced. And then immediately after reading your book, I started searching more for books like that, just because, I feel like I do a lot of work on myself anyways. And so there's times when I want to relax, I actually just want to relax. And for whatever reason, I'm not saying I don't like watching TV at all, but like maybe after an hour or so, I just, want to do something else for whatever reason. And so reading is something that I've always enjoyed, and I can read for hours and hours on end. And so, yeah, immediately after, getting your book, I was kind of searching then for more books that just had like short stories. And then ironically, like you were kind of mentioning, even though they're short stories and your mind is kind of turned off, you do reflect on these sort of lessons that you learn after, and, as simple as it may sound, but obviously as difficult as it is, a lot of it is just about, letting go and more like subtraction than like addition to your life. And that was sort of one of the, big things that I got from your book anyway, was that, you can essentially add more to your life by subtracting. And I think people are always looking to add more and add more complexity, when in reality, life and for most people is already very complex. We don't need to add more. A lot of times we need to, subtract,
Yes.
and then by subtracting, we can actually, just feel more like fulfilled overall. And so one question that I had for you today that I'm kind of interested in your response to is, what do you think overall about goal setting?
Goal setting is something that's never really resonated with me, even from many, many years ago. And I think this was when I first, changed careers, become an executive coach, which was where I started my coaching career.
Maybe we should back up there. That's kind of my fault at the beginning. I didn't let you sort of give everyone a little bit of a background about yourself. Maybe you can just let them know, what you did and what you're doing now, and then just get into the answer. I think that might just give a little bit better understanding.
Okay, cool. So the long and short of it, try and keep it short because there's a lot of it, is that when I finished school, I really wanted to go and be a doctor. I wanted to do a degree and become a doctor. And my parents had been separated for many years. And my dad basically said to me, no, he says, I'm not paying for you for 6 years to go to uni. And anyway, if you became a doctor, it would affect your relationship afterwards. And I thought, well, what do you know about relationships? Because you and my mom have broken up. But essentially, he wanted me to be financially free, independent of him as quickly as possible. So what I chose, he said, basically, go and be a secretary or do chartered accountancy. So I picked chartered accountancy, did my training, qualified, and then after that worked in investment banking within the finance area for many years. And one year I was having my yearly appraisal with the person I was reporting to, and she said, okay, where do you see your career going from here? And I thought, well, we got on really well. And I said, I don't want your job. And she says, okay. And she says, well, where else in the bank would you like to work? And I said, well, don't want to work in credit, don't want to work in risk, don't want to work in operations, don't want to work in front office. And she said, well, there's pretty much half the bank gone. She said, I think you have to have a think about what you want to do next. And so that started me off thinking, well, what do I want to do next? And through that whole thing, I realized that what I enjoyed most was not so much the work that I was doing, although I really enjoyed the role that I was doing. It was the people that I was working with. So I figured it was something people related. And at that time, so we're going back to 1998. And at that time, coaching was a new profession that had started in the States and was just freshly coming over to the UK. And I stumbled across an article in the papers about this life coach who had come over, called life coach at the time, and executive coaching was really quite new. And I looked into it and I thought, well, I think this is what I want to do. And so I changed career. And that then took me on my whole coaching journey from executive coach and transformation coach. And then I eventually actually also did health coaching with the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy. And then that took me to 20 years of coaching, 25 years of coaching maybe. And then I decided that I would do a degree in nutritional therapy because I missed out on the degree way back when, wanting to be the doctor. And then there was this thing called functional medicine, which for me really made a lot of sense, looking at a person as the integrated person and everybody as being bio-individual. And so I did a degree in nutritional therapy that was based on functional medicine. And then the lockdown happened. And then it was like, oh, is this really what I want to do? And that brought me to, I think, a real turning point anyway for me, which is when I really got myself to a point where I guess I was close to burnout because I was so used through all my corporate years and then through the coaching, my whole coaching career. I got myself so close to burnout because I was always striving, always efforting. So that kind of leads us into this whole goal setting thing, because we have this, I guess, a whole cultural, societal thing, like you must set goals, you must set big goals and all that. And I got close to burnout. And that was when I went, okay, I'm just going to try an experiment in radical surrender and see what happens. And that's exactly what I did. And for the next 9 months, I allowed myself as much as possible. It wasn't easy at the beginning to really surrender and say, okay, let me see what life is going to bring. And what, I'm going to make of it because now it was just an unknown. I said, okay, I did continue working with some coaching clients, but not many. And it's like, okay, I have no idea what I'll do. I didn't do any more nutritional therapy. And it took me comfortably, I would say, that would have been in May 21. So it took me until the December, just before Christmas, before I realized that I was now okay at not chaining myself to my desk. It didn't matter what I was doing at my desk, whether I was watching a nonsense video as part of I'm not doing anything and I'm not going to strive for anything. But I still had to be at my desk. It was only around just Christmas that year where I realized, okay, actually, it's okay. I can leave my desk on its own. It will survive without me sitting at it. So coming back to your question on goal setting, it's something that never really resonated with me particularly. But because there was always this whole thing in the Zeitgeist about, we must goal set, we must make it big, hairy, audacious goals. And all that kind of thing. And also there was a little bit of a misalignment between how I felt about goals and a lot of the work that I was doing with executive clients at that time, with them having to set goals and reach their goals, which was why I then decided that this was not in alignment with me at that time, which is why I then moved more to the personal transformation coaching side. Because I think goals, I think it's more around how that goal comes about rather than setting the goal itself. Because I think most of us have learned how to set goals from our thinking mind, and our thinking mind is limited in its perspective. It's based on what it knows from the past. It's based on what it knows perhaps from what's been read or what somebody else has done. And often it's based on, okay, this is what I think I can do. And if you do this, this is what's going to keep you safe. And so it was, okay, I must set a goal. And so I'll set a goal based on all these criteria. And yes, okay, we might have to try and set a big goal. And when we try and do that, it can be out of alignment with who we truly are. And that's when all the self-doubt comes out. That's when the imposter syndrome sets in. And that's when we also potentially, it becomes a lot more, shall we say, takes up a lot more of our energy. And we then can get to the place where we are either not fulfilled or we get close to burnout, like I did. Or some people, in fact, do burnout because they're just chasing after that goal, which is so external to us rather than something that comes from within.
Yeah. And so with some of your clients, have you seen some people say like achieve certain goals and then still not feel fulfilled or like not felt exactly the way they thought they were going to when they did reach their goals?
Absolutely. And this is particularly so, in the corporate environment. So I'm just trying to think who would be the best example. Actually, I'll give you a really simple example. So one of the clients that I was working with, she started up her own business. And the one thing, when we were sort of early on, working early on together, she said, I asked her, what would you say your definition of success would be? Because once we understand what your definition of success would be, then we might be able to set some goals in support of that. And she said, well, actually, my definition of success is actually to be able to make jelly for the kids in my own kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, because then I won't have to go into work anymore. And so we set some goals around that, and primarily it would be kind of financial goals. Where's the business going to, what's it going to hit inside of 1 year? How many clients do I need? And so on and so forth. And she came to a point where she actually then was able to take, her time was her own, more her own. And she was able to make the jelly in the middle of the afternoon for her kids in her own kitchen. But she said, I'm doing this, and I was standing there mixing the jelly, and I realized, but I still don't feel fulfilled. So she'd hit the goals that she'd set herself. The number of clients, she was working fewer hours, but she still wasn't fulfilled doing what it was that she was doing. And so as a result of that, we basically spent time after that really, in a sense, unwinding the things that you were alluding to earlier on when you were saying we take on stuff. There was so much that she had taken on in terms of how to be, who to be, what to do, that we spent time helping her sort of unwind those and be able to let go of some of that in order to be able to, in a sense, get back to know herself better.
Okay. And so how would someone really identify whether they have imposter syndrome? Like, are a lot of people walking around with this syndrome and then not knowing it at all?
Yes, I think so. I think the challenge with imposter syndrome is that it can manifest itself in what we would generally call self-doubt.
And we should define what imposter syndrome is for people who aren't aware of that as well.
Okay. So imposter syndrome is really when you are really successful, usually. Oftentimes you are pretty much very well, you're quite an expert in what you do. You probably have done well at school. You probably are recognized by other people to be good at what you do. Intellectually that you have all these and that all those things are true, but you don't feel it inside because you haven't internalized it. So there's basically a disconnect between you as who you are, as you show up, versus who you think you truly are. That makes sense?
Okay. But do you think that for some people, they achieve certain goals, but it's just that they look outside, say, to other people, and then they compare themselves to others. So, maybe they're better than 99% of people at what they do, but they just keep comparing themselves to the, 0.1% who are, significantly better. Like, would that person qualify as having imposter syndrome?
Not necessarily. It's definitely a common trait. So likewise, self-doubt is a common trait. But I think if I use the self-doubt as an example, the difference with, if I put it within inverted commas, normal self-doubt versus imposter syndrome, with normal self-doubt, what happens is yes, we doubt ourselves. We go, I don't think I can do this. But the doubt is generally at the sort of the skills level. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm going to be good enough. And then you go and do the thing. It possibly takes you outside of your comfort zone, probably takes you outside your comfort zone. You do the thing and you learn maybe from mistakes or not. And you go, I've done that. Now I know I can do it. And then you progress from there. With imposter syndrome, because it's at the identity level, the doubt is at the identity level rather than at the skills level. So it doesn't matter how many times you do the thing. Okay, I know I can do it. I know I'm actually good at it, but I still don't think I'm the person to do it.
Okay. So I could see how those would be different, but I could also see how maybe the same type of person may have both of those issues. Is that something that's common?
Yes, it is. But I would say that imposter syndrome is a lot deeper. With self-doubt, it can go away, shall I say, more easily. Although that's not to, I don't want to minimize it, because self-doubt is self-doubt, and it's a challenge for anyone who experiences it. But with imposter syndrome, it's so deep that oftentimes the person, because they haven't internalized a lot of things, what they have to do is to let go of, understand how they're thinking that's opposing themselves in the first place, and how they're dismissing a lot of, they're not even letting it through. So it doesn't matter how much anybody says, it doesn't matter how much anybody says how good they are, it's just not going to be let through. So I'll give you an example. This was when I was suffering badly from imposter syndrome, and many of my clients did achieve good results, but they would always give me credit for it. And, we'd have a conversation and they'd say, wow, I've achieved whatever it is, or I've done whatever it is, and I couldn't have done it without your help. And of course I would say thank you and all the right things. But after the call, I would be, yeah, but they didn't need me. They would have done it anyway. So there's always a discounting of self, a discounting of any of your part or any of your role that you played in anything at all that went well. So it's things like, well, they're just saying that anyway. And yes, some people with self-doubt might say that, but then it's very much like, nah, I'm not even letting it in.
And so say someone does identify with that, what techniques do you think are effective for improving imposter syndrome?
There are a whole load of exercises, I guess, that I put into the book, but actually, just as I think about it, let me just get this sheet of paper here, because I put this into the imposter syndrome book, and it's called The Inner Thinking Path. And I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, we can see it there.
So the gist of this is that it's a whole cycle, and this is really, in a sense, you could call it the overthinking cycle as well. And what's external to us is up here. And it's basically our actions and all the external events and the results and things that we see, see, hear, feel, touch, taste, those types of things. And when that happens, we process it. And we process it through what I've called here as filters. And these filters here are like internal programs. And these internal programs come about from our past experiences, our beliefs, the things we think, the things we've been told. They all form internal programs, and they then generate a kind of a meaning, or we subconsciously put a meaning onto whatever it is that we've observed. That then goes into a spiral of what we think. So I'll give an example in a minute. Let me talk this through first. That can go through into a spiral, and then what we think then effectively goes around this circle again and generates more meaning. That's when we can get into a spiral of overthinking. And however we think and feel about what it is, depending on the meaning that we've placed on it, generates how we feel. So we've probably had the example of two different people observing the same thing, and one person taking a positive perspective on it and somebody else taking a negative perspective on it. And the feelings that each person would feel would be quite different depending on that. And that relates to biochemical changes that we feel in the body that we often relate to as emotions. And that then influences our decisions on the kind of action that we take. And then that goes into some kind of result, which is essentially an external event. And so that whole cycle goes round and round. And so the bit that we really have, what happens is that we focus on the external. So we focus on all this stuff up here, and without recognizing, without knowing and understanding that's essentially fueling this cycle in terms of how we feel. And so we feel we don't have any control over anything.
Okay. So we basically, despite what you can change on the outside, your thoughts and feelings don't change. And then because your thoughts and feelings don't change, you don't feel like you have any control. You kind of feel like you're powerless.
Yes, effectively. So anything that anybody says, because the person with imposter syndrome has these filters that basically says, I'm no good, I don't belong, I'm an imposter, I'm actually not the person they think I am, this is not me. Anything that happens out here, regardless of whatever kind of action or results they get, or what anybody says, or any evidence that supports how amazing they are, this filter is still in place. So what they need to do is essentially start to change these filters by first recognizing that, one, we have these filters. Doesn't matter how they got there. It's conditioning. I guess I prefer to call it conditioning. Doesn't matter how they got there. Sometimes they're helpful, but in the case of imposter syndrome, they're not. And when we then change how we think and we start changing these filters, that then influences this whole cycle. And slowly, bit by bit, those feelings of imposter syndrome can start to fall away.
Okay. So, I am a believer, however, that, things like depression, for example, are basically almost entirely related to your circumstances, your external circumstances in your life. But I also can recognize that, two people can have the same external circumstances, and then one person could be happy and one person could be sad. So I guess your focus in your work is really on, say, not so much changing your external circumstances, but I'm sure that's part of it, but more so on the part of recognizing your external circumstances and changing your thinking, about it. And so let's just say someone does have, quote unquote, good external circumstances overall. They have a good job, they have, a good relationship, they're in pretty decent health, all these kinds of things, but they still have these negative thoughts or things that are kind of making them feel powerless about whether or not they can change their external circumstances. They still feel this cycle that you just described. And so how do you get someone to change that level of thinking? Like, how do you get someone that has these good external circumstances to stop having self-doubt and to just live more freely and to let go?
Okay, so there are a number of different sort of exercises that I get people to do, but one of them is, I guess the first thing is this whole thing around awareness. So oftentimes we are unaware that we actually have these, if you like, internal programs that are running all the time. And so we are continually, if you like, reacting to what's happening. And so we don't recognize necessarily, because nobody really told us this, that we can actually stop for a moment and go, hang on, what am I actually really thinking about this thing? So as an example, when I was working in corporate, before I did coaching, the long and short of it was that I was suddenly promoted. My boss was put onto a different, sort of sidelined a little bit, and I was meant to take her place. And at that time, I remember saying to my then partner, I didn't get promoted because I was good enough for the job. I got promoted because I happened to be there, right? So in that moment, at that time, I had no idea, I didn't know imposter syndrome existed or there was anything like it at all. There was just this thing about the instant conclusion that I just happened to be there. And so I just kind of hit it lucky. When in fact, I also knew that I was excellent at what I was doing. And so the first step really is to have the person become aware that this is the way that they're thinking about things, and then start collecting evidence and start pivoting their thought. It may be that the first thought was, I just happened to be there. And then the conscious thought that can follow it is in choosing a next thought that is only slightly better than that. So it's not about doing a 180-degree turn. Most people, oftentimes I see a lot of people saying, well, you need to think positively. And if you think, oh, I'm not good enough, you have to do a 180-degree about turn and go, well, actually, I am good enough. But I don't know if you've ever tried that. Whenever I've done it in the past, it's been like, well, who are you trying to kid? We're literally lying to ourselves, aren't we?
Yeah, I don't think most people find that technique to be effective. So I 100% agree with you on that.
Exactly. And so it's a case of pivoting and saying, well, actually, hang on a moment. What is my perspective on this? What am I actually thinking? Yeah, well, I just happen to be there. And is that true? And saying, okay, what is maybe just a 1-degree shift from that can make me feel a little bit better? Because again, if I come back to this chart, whatever it is that we're thinking generates how we feel, and then they feed on one another. So if I'm thinking, oh, I just happen to be there, I'm no good at all, the feelings aren't particularly expansive. They aren't particularly supportive for, me doing the job in the first place. And so it's making that pivot and saying, okay, what's actually a little bit different? Sort of what is actually different here? What other thought can I choose that can make me feel just a little bit better, that still feels authentic for me? And then when that feeling lifts a little bit, the next thought that comes is different, or the next decision that we might make is different, because now our state of being is a little bit different to where it was before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Like, coming back to your situation though, like, I would have probably thought, well, I put myself in this position to be able to get this job, I wouldn't have necessarily thought, I was just here and because of circumstances, things, worked out for me, or, and I'm not going to give myself any credit. It's like, there's billions of people in the world, not everyone could have gotten into this position that I could have gotten into. And so because of that, that's part of the reason. And that's like, not like, hocus pocus. Like it's absolutely true that, like, if you didn't have the training that you did, if you didn't, do well in some of your other jobs, then you wouldn't have gotten to where you were, where you would have been in that, quote unquote, like fortunate, like circumstance, and then the other part of that too, like, I don't have very many tattoos, but I have Amor Fati, tattooed on me. So, the love, fate, like that's kind of like the Nietzsche kind of thing that he talks about, and in, stoicism. I may ask you a little bit about stoicism as well, but basically just to love everything that, happens to you, and so, this happened to you and you love that it happened to you. And so you just take like the fortune, and you also understand that there's other people, that have also been in fortunate circumstances in your life. And this is the way things work out. Some of us are born into, very fortunate families. Some of us are born into very unfortunate families. And, there's some things that are, outside of our control. And so all we can really do, and this is kind of like the basis of stoicism, is just to, do what we can within our own control. So that's, again, I'm just saying that as an observer. If I was in your situation, maybe I would have, encountered the same kind of, feelings overall. But just for someone who, maybe listening to this and thinking, how they could have approached that particular situation differently, like that's something that, I like to think anyway, I would have thought of if I was in your particular, situation at that time.
Yeah. And I think, your observation of that, I think, is really spot on, because it does kind of touch a little bit on that thing we talked about earlier on about self-doubt. Because someone can be catapulted into this new role and think, oh, wow, I happen to be here. And yes, of course, I'm great for the role. They may still have that self-doubt, like, oh, but, am I good enough to really, is it, am I going to be good enough in this role? Will I be able to do it? But that once they start doing the role, many of those elements of self-doubt fall away. But with imposter syndrome, it just stays. It doesn't matter how well you've done. It doesn't matter how many more promotions you'll get. It stays with you. And then the other thing you also mentioned there, which I absolutely ascribe to, is this whole thing about, life is happening for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, there's like, when you told your story, I just kind of thought of something that happened to me. So, when I was applying for my residency, it just so happened that when I was interviewing, I was interviewed by the program director. And obviously, the program director is going to have a lot more weight than, say, someone who interviews with a resident. And, just by fluke, I was in a mall like a few weeks before, and I saw this book, Outliers, and a couple people that I was the couple of doctors actually that I was rotating through, like, talked about this book. And I thought, and I wasn't a reader at the time, and I thought, I'm going to pick this up and have a read. And anyways, he asked the question, and I know this is basically what got me into the program. He said, there's like 800 people or something applying to this. I can only pick 27. Why can I pick you? And so I said, well, I'm going to get my 10,000 hours first. And I'm going to be your first expert because, I live and breathe medicine all the time. It's not just a 9-to-5 thing for me. Like, I love health. I love medicine. I want to know as much as I possibly can. And so I'm going to get my hours in fastest and I'm going to be your first expert. And so I know, just in that moment, I was like, okay, I can see how this guy's responding. I think I'm going to get into Western. And I did. And so, for sure, there was like thoughts in my head, like, man, if I didn't interview with him, if I didn't read that book, like none of this would be happening. But, those things did happen. I did, read that book for whatever reason. And then I did get, placed with him. And, so when I was going through my residency, initially, maybe some of those things like, I'm here because of this one answer, but I also felt like, I was supposed to be there and that, I, deserved to be there in a way. So, I do think that if you, just sort of, I guess, show evidence along the way, then that sort of imposter syndrome may go away. But I also understand people who, get stuck in that thinking. And, it can certainly be difficult to, get out of. But I imagine, though, for yourself and maybe with some of your clients, it's like, just show yourself that you deserve to be there, show yourself evidence. And then eventually, or hopefully, some of those thoughts of imposter syndrome will fade away. Is that something that you've seen with some of your clients?
It can happen. In my experience, it's not, it takes more of the inner work, I guess, because it comes back so much to this whole thing around, are you letting it in? Right. So what was interesting, what you, in your story, you were saying that you sort of knew that you deserved to be there. In imposter syndrome, there is no knowing that you deserve to be anywhere.
Right.
Right. And so it's such an integral part of that whole sense of being and who we are that really dictates everything, which is why the focus really in many ways has to be on those internal programs and how can we actually start to break through these internal programs to enable, in a sense, the thinking to relax a bit. And then it's also coupled with that, being willing to open up to change the habit that somehow you gleaned along the way to not let things in. And a very simple, very, very simple exercise, which can be life-changing depending on where the person is just the ability to accept compliments. When somebody says, for example, and I don't know whether this is more pertinent for women in a way, but I'll use that example because I only say it's more pertinent perhaps for women because of the example I'm about to use. You'll see why. Oftentimes somebody might say, well, that's a lovely jacket you're wearing. And oftentimes she might say, oh, this thing, it's really old. I only bought it in the market for $5. So there's the instant discounting of a compliment or something that's true, factually true, at least from that person's perspective, that they've actually, that feedback they've given you, but there's the immediate discounting. Yes, of course, there's the politeness, thank you. But then there's the discounting, thank you, but, I got it 10 years ago and it was only a $5.
I think that people they don't want to be perceived as like arrogant. And they think that by, taking a compliment and saying thank you, that other people around them are going to think that they're arrogant, or even the person that gave them the compliment is. Do you feel like that's part of the reason?
I think that is part of the reason. And again, this has been my experience. When we are so comfortable within ourselves and who we are, there's never any arrogance, because at that level, it's just truth. And it's not like, oh, wow, I'm so fantastic. It's just like, it's just truth. And I can just accept that. So it's almost like in my ability to accept that thing at face value that somebody has, that positive feedback, shall we call it that somebody has given me. I'm also at the same time giving them the gift of being able to receive their gift of positive feedback to me. Yeah. And I remember the first time I this was when I was early in my coaching, and I went to a conference, and there was the keynote speaker. It so happened I got into the lift, and he just happened to follow behind me, and I saw him coming, and I just held the lift door open. And he was one of these keynote speakers, which I remember at the time I was just like, wow, this is just an amazing guy. He just did an amazing speech, and it was really inspiring. And I remember thinking how wonderful an individual he was to have as a speaker at the conference. And when I held the lift door open, he stepped into the lift. He said thank you with, the energy behind his, or shall we say it's almost like you can almost, how do I describe it? Somebody's vibe, somebody's vibe. We get that, we get that sense underlying that a person's thank you, whether it's authentic and true or not. And it was just so full and wholesome that you knew that the thanks was a genuine thanks rather than, oh, just thank you for holding the lift door open. And I think that was my first experience of really understanding the difference between how we, what we communicate is supported by our real state of being.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can also see too, coming back to like the compliment thing. I think that especially if there's, a group of people around and someone compliments you and then you say, thank you, like you also almost don't want other people around you to feel uncomfortable. And so you'll like make yourself uncomfortable to try to make other people not uncomfortable. Is that something that you feel like people do? Like say if someone, does give you a compliment on your looks or your speech or whatever it is, again, some of it is like, this idea that you don't want others to think that you're like arrogant, but also too, like some people will almost like, I guess maybe it's a little bit of a jealousy, and that's, a issue with them. But because of you kind of recognize that eternally, you're sort of like dismissing this particular compliment because you don't want other people to feel uncomfortable, because you think that if you take this compliment, you're going to make others feel uncomfortable, which is a little bit different even than just the arrogance aspect.
Mm. Yeah, I totally understand exactly what you're saying. And again, it comes back to the thought, right? So the thought in that example, the thinking is, will this person feel uncomfortable? Well, maybe they will and maybe they won't, but we don't know that because we don't have control over how somebody else is going to think. So it's a little bit like how I used to be. If I went to a dinner party and the dinner party was being held by a friend of mine and I brought my partner along, I would feel responsible if he didn't enjoy himself at the dinner party. But there's nothing that I could have done about it as such. And, I couldn't jump into his body and say, enjoy the party. It was really up to him whether, how he chose to be and interrelate with people to enjoy the party or not. And it's the same thing. It's we can't mind read what other people are thinking or how they are going to think. And sometimes we may, many people are not necessarily present. So as an example, we might be in a group, somebody's got their mind wandering off to something. The conversation might be around, isn't that a lovely jacket? This other person might be thinking about, some other issue they've got that they're having to handle, nothing to do with the jacket conversation. They may have a look on their face that I might mind read as, oh, this person was upset because I just said, yeah, isn't it a great jacket?
Yeah. I understand. And I think a lot of people can definitely, relate to that. In terms of like, you just brought up, someone, who you, thought was like an incredible coach and gave an incredible speech. I'm just wondering, what do you think of someone like Tony Robbins?
I think he has his place for people who are at that stage, who are in alignment with his way of teaching. So way back when I first moved into coaching, I did go to the Tony Robbins seminars. And at that time, it was a case of, wow, isn't it amazing? But for me at that time, there was an element which, again, didn't quite gel with me because he felt just too rah-rah for me.
Yeah, that's the exact thing I was going to say. It was too like rah, but it's kind of an unusual term to use, but that's the exact term I was going to use in my head. But go ahead.
Yeah. So I haven't seen him in years particularly, and I suspect this is, again, I'm making this up. I suspect he has mellowed over the years, but at that time he was certainly very, to me anyway, it seemed very black and white, all or nothing. And one of the things that I remember that I came away with where I went, this doesn't quite work for me, I don't see how it works, was because one of the things was about, you just really get yourself into this state and then off you go. And it's about you model yourself after somebody else. So if somebody else is showing up like this, model yourself after them. Well, modeling, I think, can help to a degree, but what we often fail to see is what's actually going on behind the scenes, underneath. We see what's up here and we try and model ourselves in terms of what's going on up here, but we can't see any of what's happening down here. And that's the challenging part of, I think, the concept of modeling that Tony Robbins has talked about a lot. And then also the other thing was, I tried to implement a lot of what he taught at that time. And I found myself feeling even worse than before, simply because I felt like I was being inauthentic. I felt like I was showing up, and that whole phrase, fake it until you make it.
Yeah, I don't like that either.
Yeah. And it was just like, yeah, but I know I'm faking it. And I feel so out of sorts with myself around faking it that it really felt like I was, lying to myself, and I wouldn't even do this to my best friend.
Yeah. I kind of feel too, like that fake till you make it thing, like you fake it till you make it. And then when you make it, you have to keep faking it. It's not like you can then sometimes be like your authentic self, and you're kind of trapped like faking it.
Yes.
And then so you never get to be your authentic self, which is, awful, and obviously not a way that anybody, really wants to live, or that's going to make anyone feel free.
Yes, exactly. Which also brings us back to what we were talking about earlier on with the goal setting. So often we set goals because we think it's a good goal to set, rather than because that whole, there's an inner, almost an inner, motivation is not the right word. There's almost like an inner movement, I guess is the best word that I can come up with, and almost an inner energy that's kind of pulling you in a particular direction, or you are, picking up from your story of the serendipity, seeing the Outliers book, just following what life is bringing to you.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess I won't harp on, Tony, like too much more, but I just also feel like there's a lot of people who sort of get trapped in that cycle where, they just keep going to these seminars over and over, but nothing, essentially really changes. And so, they're kind of going to these seminars just for like a bit of like a dopamine rush, or to feel like they're doing something. But in reality, their life really isn't changing too much.
Yeah.
One question that I wanted to ask you today was, how would you define emotional intelligence?
Oh, to me, emotional intelligence is firstly with understanding what's going on within yourself in terms of your own feelings. So again, coming back to that path that I was showing you earlier on, understanding that a lot of the feelings, many of which have been trapped in our nervous system at a cellular level, such that the response that we get can, again, sort of interact with those internal programs that we have, which have been locked in at a cellular level. And so we come from a place of reaction. So to me, emotional intelligence is really understanding that whatever the emotion is happening and the feelings that are being generated is oftentimes what's going on in terms of your thinking and in terms of your internal programs. And when you can increase and expand your own awareness of that and allow yourself, so it's not pushing away the feelings, not pushing away the emotions, but allow yourself to understand, what is actually going on here, where you're not then immediately reacting to somebody and immediately, let's say, losing your temper or getting angry with someone. When you can work with yourself first, that's when you can become more emotionally intelligent naturally without having to, how oftentimes I remember when emotional intelligence first came out in the workplace, it's just like, many of us used to roll our eyeballs and go, yeah, no, we're going to have to pretend that we understand this person, or we're going to have to pretend that this is not frustrating. But, that's not addressing the root cause to me.
Yeah. And so a lot of it really there is just like pausing, and I forget that, Viktor Frankl quote, but, he says that, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and in that space is our, where lies our power, or something like that. I'm kind of butchering it, but someone can easily look it up and find out exactly what the quote that I'm saying there. But yeah, I think that the key there really is, if you want to improve your emotional intelligence, is to pause. Because if you don't pause, then you're simply just reacting, and then you're not using any of your emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And just because you've paused doesn't mean that you are emotionally intelligent, or even that you're going to have like an appropriate response. But at least it gives you that space where you can potentially improve overall. And so I think that, the biggest thing for most people when they, in real life, in terms of using emotional intelligence, is when someone says something that, causes them to feel, a certain way, which is, again, a stimulus that you not necessarily can control, like that first instant, is then to pause. And then secondly, try to have understanding for where that other person is coming from. And then once you have understanding from where that other person is coming from, then you can react. And, I know that, I think you know that I'm a family doctor. And so, sometimes we have patients, obviously, who can be, extremely difficult and, can lash out, at me and my staff and that kind of thing. But, for the most part, what like kind of gets me through the day, what, allows me to kind of continue to do the work that I do, is that, you just basically place yourself in the other person's shoes. And you just realize that, if you had that person's life, if you had their circumstances, you would probably react and do the same thing. And then that's what causes you to pause and not react to that particular response that they were giving you.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes we don't even need to know, I think, what the other person's circumstances are, or even their background. So I remember one time I was in London and I was catching a bus. And as I got into the bus, I knew the bus stop that I wanted to stop at, which was one stop before this particular hotel. But I didn't know what the name of the bus stop was. And I got into the bus and I said to the bus driver, I don't know, I said Kensington Olympia, which was the name of a big exhibition center, which was one stop just before this hotel. And he barked back at me with the gruffest voice. And he said, there's no such thing as Kensington Olympia. Either you want the whatever hotel it was or the Warwick Gardens stop. And I said, oh, okay, it's Warwick Gardens. And he had shouted back at me at such, he bellowed back at me to such a level that, how when you're not expecting it, that your nervous system comes up and everything lights up inside. And my old self would have just jumped out and got angry. And I would probably have got to work and told everybody and said, oh, I had this bus driver and all that and all the story. And repeated the story 10 times over throughout the day and got upset and angrier even at the bus driver. But because I had been already working on understanding the whole issue or the whole thing about perspective, I remember stopping and saying to myself, but I don't know what happened to him this morning. Maybe, of course, now I'm making up stories just to show myself, in a sense, that there's a different perspective to take. I don't know what happened to him this morning. Maybe his wife left him before he came to work. Maybe his kid was injured before he came to work. Maybe his kid is sick and couldn't go to school and he's had to work out, childcare all of a sudden, and he's worried about that. I just don't know. So I think there is that. It's it's a case of not always taking things personally, because oftentimes most people are really caught up in their own, whatever's going on for themselves, that they haven't necessarily meant anything personally. But if we tend to come from a place of, oh, I'm going to take things personally because it's the default mode, that's when, coming back to the emotional intelligence, we come to this place where we're just reacting.
Yeah. And I think reacting, without thinking is always what, gets people into trouble. I wanted to ask you, do you approach coaching men and women differently?
No.
No? So you don't think that there's anything that men struggle with more than women do, or that women struggle with more than men do?
I think the reason why I say not specifically, because a lot of the people that I've worked with have tended to be people who've been either in a corporate setting or working in business for themselves. So what I've found is that where I have worked with women in those types of settings, they tend to have quite a lot of, shall I say, masculine energy about them as well, and a way of approaching things which is, shall I say, very corporate. So there's not that much difference. But what I do find is, or can be different, is that with the guys, they can be very, like when I think of the many people that I've worked with, the guys can be, I'll have a conversation and they'll say, okay, meaning it's done. I know that the next time I have a conversation with them, it's done. For the lady, oftentimes there's other stuff that comes up. So I think a good example of this would be, I don't know whether you've seen this before. It's if you give a man a job spec, he will look at the 10 items that have been identified on the job spec, and he'll identify maybe he can do 6, and he'll go, yep, I can do this job. I'm going to apply for the role. Whereas the average lady would go, oh, here are 10 things. I can't tick all the boxes, so I won't apply for the role. So that's one of the fundamental differences that I have noticed over the years. But in terms of how I approach them, generally, I approach them all the same, because it really is individual. You can have a bloke show up and overthink things in the same way as the woman might.
Okay. So you don't think that in certain ways, like men sort of, well, I guess because you said you work with, corporate clients, everyone's kind of like vying for power in a certain type of way, but you don't feel that like when men in particular, say achieve more power, say that they may almost struggle with imposter syndrome in a way, say more than women would, or maybe the opposite in some degree as well. Like meaning that, say, if a man does change his external circumstances, he wouldn't struggle with that thinking less or more than, say, if a woman, say, changed her external circumstances, she wouldn't struggle with the thinking of imposter syndrome, more or less. It's basically essentially the same.
I think how it shows up is a little bit different. So I think, and again, it's generalization, right? So it's a little bit difficult to say that every male person will be this way and every female will be this particular way. But I think how it shows up is that when men suffer from imposter syndrome, they might go, okay, I'm going to have to force myself and do this thing. So they push themselves outwards more so than the woman might shrink back.
Okay.
Right. But the internal feeling is exactly the same. Whatnot.
What about when you're comparing like romantic relationships, and not necessarily men and women even differently, but do you feel that, someone's romantic relationship can significantly impact whether or not they have imposter syndrome, or certainly the degree or severity of it?
I don't know. I haven't thought about that.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if that's something that, came through with some of your clients, like maybe when people have certain unhealthy relationships, like some of those, self-doubts and things like that could be influenced, unfortunately negatively, but maybe sometimes it can be improved, as well, by their partner or by the person that they're in a romantic relationship with.
I think it can be influenced. And then again, the question that comes up for me is, is it the chicken or the egg? Yes. Because, is the person thinking a particular way that's led them to be with this particular partner who kind of fuels that whole cycle.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I know that our hours, coming to an end here now. I don't know if you have time just for one more question.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I know that you're trained in NLP. NLP is something that maybe a lot of people are not familiar with, so maybe you can just define that first. But is this something that you think that everyone should learn to a certain degree and could benefit from?
Okay, so NLP is neurolinguistic programming, and it's really about how our mind and our language influences our thought and behavior, and therefore the results that we actually get. And again, it ties back into what we were looking at earlier on in terms of the internal programs, and how it's caught in our, if you like, in our neural pathways that actually influences then how we behave. I think it is something that can be helpful. To me, I think it really depends on the teacher. So what I mean by that is there are some people who teach NLP in a very, shall I say, in a way that is true to the subject, but doesn't dig deeper. It's very linear in the way that it's presented by some teachers. So I think it really depends who's teaching it and how they're teaching it. The teacher that I happened to have when I was studying it for a while came from a very spiritual background. So he was a Reiki master. He was into Huna. He understood about ancient wisdoms. He understood about Kabbalah. He understood about Hermetic philosophy. And he had a very, very broad perspective on things. And so however he taught us NLP, he taught us very much from understanding what was going on underneath just the thinking as well. So understanding the whole energetics behind it and how, these things are trapped cellularly and almost like in an energetic or energy package that kind of opens up and releases, say, that trapped emotion, which perhaps isn't necessarily the way that's taught in everyone who teaches NLP.
Okay. And so for the average person who's like interested in, improving imposter syndrome, if they feel that they have it, if this conversation is really resonate with them, would you encourage them to look into NLP, or would you just say, it's not something that is completely necessary, but, it could be beneficial for certain people if they have the right coach?
I think it can be beneficial. I think, of course, I would say this, get the book, Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome. Many of the exercises in there they did come from a history of my NLP training, but I overlaid a lot of it with a lot of everything else that I had learned over the years that didn't necessarily come from NLP. So I'm not saying that NLP wouldn't be helpful, because it certainly can be to a degree. And I think it really depends on where the person is in their journey. For some people, even hearing the term NLP, they can't hear it, because NLP in and of itself also over the years in certain areas has had bad rap because of the way that some people have talked about it being potentially manipulative. For example, when people talk about it in the context of how would you use this in a sales situation to try and, close the deal.
Right.
So, So in some factions, it has had bad rep. And so I think it really just depends on where the person is in their journey and, where they're getting their information from. So it can be helpful, without a doubt, coming from the right place.
Okay. So, talking about, your book and everything else that you're doing, where can people learn more about you? Where can they get your books, and what else do you have in store for us in the future?
Okay. Thank you. So they can find me at serenachoo.com, CHOO.com. That's the website. And it's a very, very basic website. So it just tells you about the 2 books and a little bit about myself. The books you can get the books on Amazon. So there's Letting Go of Imposter Syndrome, and there's The Monkey and the Way of Zen. And in terms of what next, I've been working on the second book. In the first book, in The Monkey and the Way of Zen, he goes to a temple and learns the various things. And in the second book, I'm having him leave the temple. So he's now leaving the safety of his time with the master and having to handle various challenges that many of us see on a day-to-day, and having to question himself or find his own sort of inner perspective on things in order to find the peace that he really so was looking for when he started out his journey.
Well, that's amazing. And again, it's I don't know how you really come up with these stories, but because they're, it takes a lot to be able to, take such a very, very complex, topic and then put it into like a teachable story and then to write a story about it. So, I really compliment you on that. And like I said, I absolutely loved your book. I'll definitely be getting your second one for sure. And it's been a pleasure to chat with you today. So thank you so much again for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure for me too. Been really good chatting.
Excellent. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.